I collapsed on the hard, cold gymnasium floor. I was paralyzed at the thought of moving. My teammates and coach rushed over to where I had fallen and quickly attempted to communicate with me. I was unable to move. Just intense throbbing. Oh goodness, the throbbing was so intense I thought my head had turned into a balloon and was about to burst. All I managed to do was spit out, "I'm okay." I had been completely unaware of the damage that had just been done and the effect it had had on me. After what felt like a century, I managed to slowly lift my head up from the ground. The room spun round and round as I tried to open my eyes. As soon as I did this, a fear grew inside me as those around me gasped. It was at this moment I knew that I was not okay. I remember the beginning of that day like any normal one. It started with a long morning of classes, 2 to be exact. At the time, this was the most amount of classes in one day. Man, it's amazing to see the differences in schools. The day dragged on as I went through my normal routine. This involved classes, lunch, homework, and then practice. After my classes ended that morning, I walked across campus to the big building with the gym located inside it. I didn't normally stay here all day when I had practice in the evening, but I crashed my car a few months earlier and had been dropped off by my mom. I went inside the double doors and walked past the athletic secretary's office and said hello. She was by far one of the greatest assets of being on the volleyball team. She was such a kind soul who was always your biggest fan. After a few life updates to Kara, I went down the stairs towards the locker room. On the way inside, I peeked in the gym. It always looks so different without a net set up, players inside, or even the lights on. As I made my way into the locker room, I heard my stomach growl, which made me realize I probably should have packed a substantial lunch. Regardless, it was too late now, so I set my stuff down and went back upstairs to the vending machine. I grabbed some fruit snacks and Cheez-Its and went down to get started on some homework. After several hours of homework and an attempted nap, it was time to get ready for practice. I changed first. It was so cold in the locker room that I immediately put on a sweatshirt over my red shirt. It was a bright red, so I knew my coach wouldn't question if I forgot to match the rest of the team, which was required. Next, I put on a pair of sweatpants over my black spandex shorts. I then put on my long white socks and knee pads that desperately needed to be washed. Lastly, I slipped on my white shoes that also matched the rest of the team. At this point, other girls were arriving for our usual practice, so I gathered my things and met them in the gymnasium. After a few dramatic hellos with my closest friends, we began to set up. The variety of balls were brought from the hallway supply closet to the edge of the gym. A few girls were in charge of checking them all to see if any needed to be aired up. The rest of us started to set up the net and tape the floors. At the time, the gym only had lines painted on the court for 1 net to be set up, not 2. So whenever we set up 2 nets for practice, we also had to tape the floors to create our out-of-bounds line. I was part of the crew that set up the net on this particular day. First, we brought over the poles and removed the covers on the ground so we could drop them in. Next, we brought out the net, unfolded it, and put the string over the top of the poles. My specific job was cranking up the net. I used a crank that attached to the pole and would crank it until the net was as tight as can be and high enough to be regulation. At first, this is an easy task. Then it becomes harder to turn the crank. However, it still was not high enough, so I had to keep going. While doing this, I noticed that the rope seemed to be frayed ever so slightly, yet nothing to worry about. Man, was I wrong. All it took was 1 too many turns around and snap! The thin rope snapped and my head received the backlash from it. I instantly fell to the floor, not even understanding what just happened. I remember being completely out of it and feeling a ton of pressure around the left side of my head. I heard the muffled sound of my teammates around me trying to talk to me, along with the loud pounding of my coach's footsteps as she walked over to me. I managed to lift my head up, and as soon as I did, several of my teammates gasped, and I heard an "Oh my gosh!" Without being able to process what exactly happened, my coach took me aside and called our athletic trainer to see what should be done about the massive bump I had covering the left side of my forehead. After she got off the phone, she informed me we were going to the hospital where they take athletes because our athletic trainer worked there in her free time. Once we arrived, I got another look of shock from the receptionist who was checking me in. and after several long minutes of my head throbbing in a waiting room, I got pulled into a conference room with the doctor so she could quickly look at the extent of the injury. She told us that even though I was not in extreme pain, it was too severe for them to be able to treat it. Meanwhile, I had called my mom and she was 45 minutes away from me. So, as we were moving from place to place, I was texting her with updates. Once we arrived at the next hospital, I had to go through the standard questions of my name, address, parents, birthday, and walk them through what had happened. Luckily, my coach was there to help with what had happened because my head was throbbing so bad I could barely focus. After waiting for what felt like forever, I was brought back to a room. At this point, my mom had arrived with my little brother, who was appalled at the large mass protruding from the side of my head. The doctor came in and examined it and was surprised at the amount of information I was able to recall, such as my parents' birthdays. After about an hour of being in the emergency room, they concluded that there was, surprisingly, no long-term damage and just declared it a hematoma with a concussion. They told me no volleyball until my concussion was gone, which meant several weeks of inactivity, which was honestly more painful than the injury itself. However, I was thankful that it wasn't as serious as it looked. Finally, I was able to head home. I remember being so excited to lay down and go to sleep that night, except it wasn't easy with the amount of pain I was in. I knew the road to recovery would be a long one, since I had already had my fair share of concussions. However, I was relieved and grateful that I had such an awesome support team assisting me, and that it wasn't as serious as it could have been.